Argyll on the west coast of Scotland. This ancient landscape of mountains, islands and long sea lochs was once the cradle of the Scottish nation. It's also a place that's inspired visitors and tourists for the last 200 years, drawn here by the incomparable scenery and a haunting atmosphere shaped by 2,000 years of myth and legend.
I've always said that if you want to experience the real Scotland, the true spiritual heart of the country, then you should come here to Argyll. And even on a grey, windy day like today, this place has a magic all of its own. But then I would say that, wouldn't I? This is where I grew up.
As a child, Scotland remained a mystery to me until my father rediscovered an old copy of Black's picturesque guide to Scotland. It had been in my family for generations, and in Victorian times was the most influential tourist guidebook of all. Inspired by the routes suggested by Black's, my father took us all over the country, searching for Scotland's special places. Now, 4 decades on, I'm letting the pages of Black's guide me again as I follow in the footsteps of the early tourists. On my grand tour, I'll also discover the works of some early travel writers who came in search of the true spirit of Scotland. My grand tour begins just north of the Firth of Clyde in Cowal and follows a network of now forgotten steamer routes from loch to loch, finally reaching the fabled island of Islay, the whisky capital of the West. This is Loch Eck. According to Black's guide, Loch Eck is a very pleasing miniature lake, embosomed in green mountains of graceful and rounded outline. Soft it seems to lie and tenderly protected amongst the green hills of Cowal.
In the spirit of adventure, I'm handling my own canoe, as they say. In this case, a beautiful replica of the original Rob Roy canoe, built in the 1890s.
Although Black's guidebook doesn't have anything to say about canoeing as a pastime, increasing numbers of Victorian gentlemen were inspired by the daring adventures of a canoeing Scot, John MacGregor, inventor of the Rob Roy leisure canoe.
As a young man, John MacGregor had travelled in the wilds of Canada and was inspired by the Native American canoes he saw there. When he got back to Scotland, he decided to build his own and named it Rob Roy in honour of his illustrious MacGregor ancestors.
He wrote about his travels in a ripping yarn called 1,000 Miles in the Rob Roy Canoe. After taking on supplies, I shoved off into the tide, lit a cigar, and felt I had really started. But then began a strange feeling of freedom and novelty. I was in a canoe which could be paddled or sailed to Rome or Hong Kong if I liked.
Ah, the freedom of the open water.
The illustrious John MacGregor had much to say on the subject of canoeing, including tips on the best attire for the budding paddler. For the gentleman, he recommends a flannel Norfolk jacket, flannel shirt, and a straw hat, which he says is the best of all for boating. With my own hat firmly clamped over my ears, there can be no better way of exploring these secluded waterways than by paddling one of Mr. MacGregor's famous canoes.
I grew up close to the shores of Loch Eck, so I'm naturally a wee bit biased, but for me, this has to be one of the prettiest stretches of water to be found anywhere in Scotland.
When I was a boy, I didn't realise the role that Loch Eck once played in the development of Scottish tourism. In 1827, the genius and pioneering marine engineer David Napier built one of the world's first iron ships to carry tourists on the sheltered waters of Loch Eck. Napier was a real innovator. He wanted to open up a new route from the Clyde to the Hebrides and saw Loch Eck as a shortcut. Napier built hotels, piers, boats, and even a steam carriage to carry his passengers on overland sections of what became known as the famous Loch Eck route. Change days. All that's left of Napier's dream are a few rotting wooden piers.
The Loch Eck route could never really compete with the bulk of tourist traffic using steamers on the Clyde as a way out to the west. And sadly, Napier's boats were hauled ashore and abandoned to the elements. And there hasn't been a steamer on Loch Eck for over 70 years.
For the next leg of my journey, I follow Napier's Loch Eck route northwards, finally emerging at the sea and into lovely Loch Fyne.
Although the adventurous Scot John McGregor was the first to bring canoeing, or should I say kayaking, to public attention, the sport remained in the doldrums for decades. But then in 1936, a couple of idealistic Scotsmen rediscovered the delights of paddling your own canoe for themselves when they embarked on a daring trip to discover the true spirit of Scotland.
Alistair Dunnett and his friend James Adam, otherwise known as Seamus, were barely out of their teens when they embarked on their great expedition and became known to the world as the Canoe Boys. Clad in kilts and as keen as mustard, Alistair and Seamus set off on their 11-week adventure, kayaking from the Clyde to the Isle of Skye. Theirs was a boys' own adventure par excellence, and to find out more, I've joined kayaking expert Duncan Winning on a short section of the Canoe Boys' original route, coming ashore in a bay on Loch Fyne.
Duncan, the Canoe Boys have become legendary. Who were they and what were they trying to do?
Well, they were a couple of young journalists and they were trying to do two things, I think, mainly. One was trying to run a magazine for boys called The Claymore to encourage the youth of Scotland in the great outdoors and the things that were available for them to do on their doorstep. And one of the other things they were trying to do through their trip was they were very keen in promoting a revival in the economic activity in the islands and the Highlands.
The Canoe Boys weren't interested in the Scotland of the guidebooks. They were concerned with the plight of the modern Highlander, not the romantic image. But the reading public cared less for their politics than the novelty of their great adventure, the excitement of two canoeing novices braving the elements in boats held together by screws and wire.
I think it was something like September they set off from memory, and as they progressed up the west coast, of course, the weather deteriorated, and they actually ended up finishing their epic journey at Kyle of Lochalsh.
It seems to me that the Canoe Boys were pretty brave in what they did.
They were indeed. Compared to modern canoeists, they roughed it, and they put up with a lot of harsh conditions. They threw themselves into the deep end. So yes,
almost literally there.
Yes, let's put it this way, I don't think I would have done what they did.
I don't think I would have done it either.
Leaving Duncan to paddle home, I make my watery way across Loch Fyne to Inverary, the Highland capital of Argyll. According to Blacks, its situation is exceedingly beautiful. Here nature is so vast and grand that works of art diminish in her awful presence. Blacks was not alone in admiring Inverary. The eminent philosopher Edmund Burke considered the landscape here to represent the quintessence of sublime beauty. He thought the scenery was stunning. So too did the artist Turner, who captured the magic of the scene in watercolours. And in 1796, the early travel writer Sarah Murray considered Inverary to be the noblest place in Scotland, although she was dismayed by the miserable weather.
Inverary Castle, home to the Campbell Dukes of Argyll, has been attracting tourists for almost 200 years. In fact, it's Black's #1 recommendation, although I have to say, the tone adopted by my old guide is a bit obsequious, in fact, a bit grovelling. For example, it says here, the castle is reached through the grounds, which by the liberality of the noble proprietor are open to the public.
But not all visitors were overawed by the ducal pile. In 1787, the poet Robert Burns visited the town and wrote pointedly about the social divisions he found here. Whoe'er he be who sojourns here, I pity much his case, unless he's come to wait upon the Lord their God, his grace.
A few years later, the poet William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy visited the town on their Highland tour, and they too saw the contrast between the wealth of the Duke and his castle and the poverty in the streets.
We passed through the town, which is a doleful example of Scotch filth, a melancholy spectacle giving the notion of either vice or extreme wretchedness. Happily, there's no sign of Scotch filth on the windy streets of Inverary today, which seems spotlessly clean and peopled exclusively by the virtuous. But to find out more about the gulf between vice and virtue, rich and poor, I've come to another of Inverary's popular tourist attractions, the jail. I'm met by the formidable figure of Hannah Nixon.
Hello, Hannah.
Good afternoon.
Lovely to meet you.
In her role as prison matron, it's Hannah's job to educate and entertain modern tourists on visits to this once grim penal institution.
This is the old prison. I'll take you to a cell which shows you how it really was in the early days. You're talking about 1820 when we first opened. You would have had 3-4 prisoners in every cell originally. You can see here, this is...
In this small space?
In this small space. Right. You know, sleeping on the floor, men, women, children, criminally insane all together in the prison. You've got a good example here of a prisoner that was in 1820. He's obviously a prisoner with a sense of humour. He's written on the wall there, a room to let to the 26th day of June, application to be made to Duncan Campbell, jailer, Hugh Curry is off forever. So if you're wanting a cell to live in, he's off, you can have this one if you make the application.
Role play at Inverary is part of the modern tourist experience. Not only is there a prison matron, I'm about to meet one of the inmates too.
Another cell and a prisoner.
A prisoner, this is Elizabeth. This is a good example of the reforms of Scotland kicking in now, 1841, and the cleanliness that the prisoners would have to endure, really.
She doesn't look very happy.
Well, unfortunately, she had lice. She wouldn't wash properly, so we have had to go to drastic measures. I hope you've not got a weak stomach, sir.
I have a slightly weak
Do
stomach.
you?
Yes,
Elizabeth, take your bonnet off, please. We have had to shave her head. If you don't wash properly, this is what will happen to you.
Right,
It's
right.
to teach you a lesson. You all right? Behaving yourself? Yes. She's in for theft.
She's in for theft. So what did you steal?
I stole 2 silver jugs from a hotel in Dunoon where I was working.
Right. And how long did you get?
I got 2.5 years, sir.
2.5 years. So that's 1 year and 3 months per jug.
Is it, sir?
Yeah. Do you think that was worth it?
It was at the time, sir.
Despite prison reforms, crime was still harshly punished in Victorian times.
So this is a good example of the punishment set with the reforms of Scotland. This is the whipping table.
A whipping table?
If you disobey our rules here, you will be beaten. Now, it is just for the males, boys as well. Children as young as 7 would come to this prison. If you disobey our rules, a child may well be beaten.
And beaten with this?
Yes, that's the birch.
So how did this contraption work?
Well, the best way is to demonstrate it, Sarah. If I take that and you'd like to lie up there.
Okay, it looks quite innocuous
on your stomach.
It's a bit like a massage table or something.
It won't feel like a massage, Sarah.
Want to put my arms through here?
Straight through.
Okay.
At Inverary Jail, visitors are encouraged to sample even the grimmest aspects of prison life. The experience can sometimes take quite a beating.
Oh, that was painful. That was painful. Slightly risible, but I suppose what I find curious is why people on holiday want to come to a prison. Is there a kind of misery tourism going on here, do you
There
think?
is really. People have always been interested in what we would nowadays call the macabre, anything to do with death, torture, damnation. People like to come, have a go, see what it was like, try all the different things that we have here. Today, yes, it is very humorous for them, but it does give them an idea of what went on in the past.
As matron leads me back through the prison to freedom, she tells me that in Victorian times, people would go on holiday and visit prisons like this. It's amusing to think that a century later, modern tourists are still doing the same thing. Back on the streets of Inverary, it looks as if we're in for a spot of rain. Before I catch the worst of the weather, it's time to move on and over the hills to my next destination, Loch Awe. Loch Awe is the longest freshwater loch in Scotland and is, without question, an absolute treasure, whatever the weather.
Black's is fulsome in its praises, describing the loch as a glittering jewel with green bowered islands nestling on the bosom of the lake. Not today, it isn't.
Come rain or shine, the Victorians were quick to see the tourist potential of lovely Loch Awe. And at one time, as many as 15 steamers sailed among the wooded islands. But of course, progress has meant that these elegant little ships suffered the same fate as nearly all the other steamers on Scotland's lochs. They were scrapped years ago.
The steamer may have gone, but the landscape is just as spectacular and wild as it was when Victorian tourists were told enthralling legends about the landscape as they sailed amongst the islands of the loch.
Hearing these romantic tales, told to them by their kilted Highland guides in this wonderful setting, made Victorian tourists feel close to the true spirit of Scotland. Here, every island, every inlet and bay has a tale of its own, part of a tradition that connects Loch Awe to an epic past. As I make my way down the loch, I am passing through 2,000 years of history, heading for the cradle of the nation. This is Kilmartin Glen. I've always thought that this part of Argyll has a magic of its own. There's something about the quality of light here, the distant views to the islands, the long sea lochs and the roughly wooded hillsides that's particularly atmospheric. It's also a place with a special significance in the history of the Scottish nation. Kilmartin Glen has one of the most important concentrations of Neolithic and Bronze Age remains in Scotland. Within just a few miles, there are over 350 ancient monuments, making this a unique ceremonial landscape that was once sacred to our ancestors.
For 3,000 years, this tiny, damp corner of Scotland was an important centre for different people and different cultures, from the Stone Age right up to the early Christian period when the country we now call Scotland was coming into being. And the most striking and significant of all the ancient monuments associated with this story can be found right here at Dunad.
Now, it might not look much, but this small rocky hill is where the story of the nation really begins. This is the cradle of Scotland. 1,600 years ago, a fort stood at the top of this hill. Over the years, it's become a place of pilgrimage for tourists. And it was up here, on a sacred stone, that the kings of Dalriata were invested with their royal powers.
Now this is where it's all said to have taken place. Over here is a stone footprint cut into the rock. Now according to archaeologists, this is where the king-to-be would have placed his own foot in a ritual act that symbolised the union of the human world with the divine. Now, I'm not the first person to have noticed that this kingly footprint is a bit, well, diminutive. Now, I'd say that was probably a size 3.
You can get a sense of why Dunad was so important to the ancient world from the summit. It lies at the centre of a landscape that has an almost mystical atmosphere. Up here you get a powerful feeling of being in touch with the distant past, which is why, for me, this could be the spiritual heart of Scotland. But there is another contender for the title of spiritual heart, and to get there, I have to sail to the islands. On the next leg of my journey, I'm crossing the sea to Islay, the spiritual home of whiskey. But this is no scheduled ferry service. To retrace the old steamer routes, that once crossed the west coast, I've joined Sandy Campbell aboard the modern motor cruiser Venture West.
Sandy, what kind of business do you run then?
Well, just a charter boat business. Take people where they want to be, along with some wildlife trips and coral wrecking trips to the whirlpool. And there's usually it's quite a good kind of area for wildlife. There's some seagulls that nest in the north end there, along with there's a lot of seals and porpoise. Sometimes have dolphin. Later on in the year we have some basking shark and a minke whale around. So yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Sandy's high-tech rib is a far cry from the steamers that carried the few early tourists who ventured this far off the beaten track. As Blacks notes, the traffic of the Westward Isles is maintained by steamers of the smaller class, the natives herding on the foredeck, Gaelic their dialect, and teetotalism a creed little believed in.
Now, I think it's odd that my guide should make such a sneering reference to the pleasures that ordinary folk could derive from alcohol, because in the very next sentence, the same writer goes on to praise Islay for the quality of its whiskey. Now, I think what he's trying to imply here is that it's okay for wealthy tourists to enjoy the water of life, but for ordinary people, it's degrading. Wealthy people could be connoisseurs. The poor just got drunk.
As I consider the mixed morals of Victorian tourists, I enjoy a large glass of whiskey. I count myself lucky that I'm a connoisseur and not a lush. Anyone arriving in Islay today can't fail to notice the continuing importance of whiskey. Famous names greet you at every turn. Lagavulin, Laphroaig, Bowmore. Villages celebrated the world over because of the whiskey that comes from them. This is Port Ellen. In 1868, Blacks wrote encouragingly, "A fair entertainment may be had in the inns above the harbour, a smart trade going on in the consumption of whiskey."
Just smell that. That's the tangle of the Isles, a wonderful combination of peat smoke, seaweed, and whiskey.
For me, Ushkavar, the water of life, has its spiritual home right here on Islay, and I'm just one of thousands making the pilgrimage each year to the island made famous because of its spirit.
We love the Islay whiskey. The peaty taste is our favorite.
There's so many different whiskies, they all taste different. It's interesting to learn about how they turn out different.
We know this whiskey for a few years, but it's the first time that we are here on Islay directly.
To find out more about the arcane, magical art of whiskey making, I've joined Duncan McGilvery on a tour of the Bruichladdich distillery. Duncan tells me that Islay has been on the whiskey connoisseur's itinerary for well over 100 years. In 1886, the island, its drinking habits and its water of life were all lovingly and minutely described by an Englishman, Alfred Barnard.
Alfred Barnard did a survey in the late 1800s of all the distilleries in Scotland and England and Wales, I believe, that he could find. Not that I was around at the time, but it was a very in-depth investigation into what they did, and the results of his survey and the conclusions are absolutely priceless. In those days it was rare to find a whisky connoisseur because whisky was just a way of life and it was a means to make money. Nowadays so many people are so much better educated about whisky, and whisky stroke tourism on Islay must be one of the biggest earners that there is on the island, along with bird watching and nature, etc. But whisky has become very much a tourist industry.
Barnard not only wrote extensively and passionately about whiskey, he was also the first to celebrate the special relationship between booze and the environment.
Barnard's book isn't just an account of whiskey, it is in fact a love story. The story of a man's infatuation with a landscape and a culture that's produced a world-beating spirit.
To find out more about the fruitful marriage between whiskey, tourism and fabulous scenery, I'm meeting up with historian Kevin James at Duffy's Bar, which has over 250 brands of whisky to choose from. Apparently the most expensive dram will set you back 250 quid. Let's hope Kevin's buying.
Kevin, Bernard's book was seminal in many ways, was it not, in kicking off whisky tourism. But he seems to have a special love for Scottish landscape. And there's a connection, I think, between the landscape and the whisky.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, and particularly in the Hebridean landscape. I think that he has an affection for the wildness of the landscape. There are occasions in which he comments on the kind of the almost austereness of the Hebridean landscape, and I think that he works that into his overall appreciation of the malts as well. And I think that's one way of kind of casting Barnard's book, and indeed the whole whiskey tourism phenomenon, is people trying to penetrate beyond the visual landscape and get into the culture by other ways, engaging their senses in other ways. And what better way to do it than through drink? Right, so you didn't just come to Islay to drink in the landscape. You came to Islay, had a drink, and looked at the landscape at the same time. And maybe saw it in different ways. Right, so do you think, in becoming connoisseurs, some Victorians felt that they had a kind of special knowledge, not just of the drink, but of the culture, and a knowledge in some ways that was more sophisticated than local people's understanding of the drink? Yeah, I think they could assert that they had a more tasteful appreciation of the culture and a more tasteful appreciation of the drink itself as well. That's really interesting, because in many ways whiskey, ushkiva, is a kind of wild drink. It's a wild and dangerous drink associated with rebellion, the Jacobite rebellion, but somehow the Victorians and tourism had tamed this drink, had tamed the spirit of Scotland. It is. It's like taming a primitive aspect of Scottish peasant culture, and it's also allowing the tourist to distance him or herself from the culture at the same time as taking one of the icons of that culture, whiskey, and consuming it. Right, well, I'm going to have a wee sláinte. Sláinte. That's not the £250 a dram. It isn't. Ardbeg, is it? It's not bad. It's not bad. It'll do.
Armed with a bottle of the finest malt, but one that's not going to break the budget, I leave Kevin and make my way to the coast. As I found for myself, the spirit of Scotland is not easily tamed. But that doesn't deter people from hoping to discover something that captures the essence of the place, the landscape, history and culture. Many claim to have found it in the views of the lochs and islands of the west coast. While some believe it lies in the past, others think that the spirit of Scotland is a commodity that can be bottled. For me, the truth lies somewhere in between.
There are lots of different ways you can drink whiskey, of course. Some people take it with ice on the rocks, and others like to add a wee drop of water. And some, heaven forbid, drink it as a mixer. Personally, I like to drink it neat and outside with a view of the Atlantic and the smell of the sea in my nostrils. And even on a grey, cold day like today, I can think of no more appropriate place to experience the true spirit of Scotland. Sláinte.
Join me on my next grand tour when I go in search of sunshine.